Joining us for today's roundtable, Pete Seat, former White House spokesman for President George W. Bush. Also with us, senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner, David Drucker. Gentlemen, good to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
All right, David, let's start with you. You're writing about this today in the Washington Examiner, and I love this line in your article, quote, "Some veteran Republican operatives can't help but chuckle at the predicament conservatives find themselves in. They've spent years accusing so-called establishment Republicans of being insufficiently conservative. Now they are facing similar charges of heresy from the populist wing." But are they really laughing, though, David?
Well, it's a double-edged sword there. I think they're laughing at the predicament that the movement conservatives find them in, at least some of them, simply because they believe there's a segment of the community of movement conservatives that have been tearing down the Republican Party and its brand and accusing the establishment of being everything that's wrong with the party, because the assumption was they'd get to rebuild it in their image, and lo and behold, Trump and the populist wing is stepping in to claim conservatism as their mantle. So there's a little bit of Schadenfreude there, if you will, but I think that everybody, both establishment-minded and movement conservatives, are worried about Trump and what he might do to redefine the Republican Party away from something that is a vehicle for conservative governance. And the major differences between the establishment types and the insurgents really isn't policy, although a lot of them think so, but it's really about tactics. But there's a huge gulf between the populists and everybody else, because everybody else generally believes in free markets, generally believes in free trade, generally believes in lower taxes and smaller government. And the populists, although they make common cause with the insurgents on immigration and things like that, they're not big on free trade, they're not big on necessarily free markets, they don't mind tax increases, and they don't mind big government as long as it's going to sort of help them out and not people who they think are undeserving.
Right. Jonathan Martin with the New York Times just posted an article about the intellectuals within the Republican establishment talking about this manifesto they're going to draft against Donald Trump. But Pete, when you look at Bob Dole, he's not exactly a populist. What did you make of his comments? And does this really support the idea that the establishment donor class might be warming up to the idea of Trump the nominee?
Well, I think it tells you how much people dislike Ted Cruz that they're willing to start lining up with Donald Trump, of all people, in order to stop Ted Cruz. But look, the thing with Cruz and Bob Dole's comments is Ted Cruz is all about ideology. Of course, he has a very brash personality. People in the United States Senate and elsewhere aren't fond of him, but it's all about ideology with him, and that turns off a lot of voters in general elections. When it comes to Trump, I don't think you can really say what his ideology is. I mean, not that long ago, he was giving to very liberal causes. Now he's trying to pretend to be a conservative. So we're not sure where he stands. But with Ted Cruz, it's very clear. And there's now this fear, and why people are starting to warm up to Donald Trump, which I don't think is the right answer. But that tells you how scared they are of Ted Cruz getting this nomination.
Pete, you say that like you're not buying it, even with Palin's endorsement, that you're just not buying that Trump is who he claims to be.
No, not at all. And you have, I mean, I think Glenn Beck was the perfect complement to the Sarah Palin endorsement, because let's be honest, they're both entertainers. Yeah, she was the governor of Alaska for about a minute. She's now a reality TV star. She's an entertainer. That's also what Glenn Beck is. So if you're going to fight fire with fire, why not?
David, do you agree with that?
Well, look, I do agree that I think Sarah Palin is more of an entertainer and belongs in the populist wing than she does in the movement conservative wing. And you know, I'd say, to pick up on what Pete said, I think it's important to understand that for people like Bob Dole or Republican senators who sound like they're cozying up to Trump instead of Cruz, it's because it has nothing to do with ideology or a concern that Cruz is going to take away all their goodies. They don't like Cruz. They hate his guts. Why? Because he's run around Washington calling them liars and corrupt charlatans who care about nobody but themselves.
So really, this is not a vote for Trump. This is a vote against Cruz.
This is not business. This is personal.
Right. Yeah.
I would add to that, though, that my reporting tells me that ultimately, if it really does become a Cruz or Trump choice, most of the establishment will go with Cruz, because at least he will maintain the party as a vehicle for conservatism of some sort. That is going to override most concerns. It's not just domestic issues. It's foreign policy issues, which motivates a lot of the Republican donor base. And that's why Cruz will ultimately get the lion's share of the so-called establishment, even though they'll be gritting their teeth the whole time.
And he has passed that test of winning an election, something
Right.
that Donald Trump has not done, and at least that might help some people sleep at night, considering that he's played the game a little bit. Gentlemen, stick around. We got much more to come. We're going to continue to talk about this a little bit. We got other angles of the story to get to.
Yes, we sure do. Here are some thoughts to ponder. If the GOP establishment is really warming up to Donald Trump, why is he and Mama Grizzly going after the establishment? And is that really a good idea? Also coming up straight ahead, what makes a good political ad? Newsmax.com takes a look at some of the most effective this election cycle. J.D. Hayworth will give us his take. See for yourself when Newsmax Now continues.
Well, a couple of campaign events yesterday, which featured Donald Trump and Sarah Palin on the stump. She endorsed, of course, Donald Trump, the Republican frontrunner, earlier this week. But that's not all that was said.
Not every conservative has had the guts to talk about the real issues that are needing to be discussed and debated. Our candidate is ballsy enough to get out there and put those issues on the table.
The hatred, and what it is establishment. Because I'm not taking anybody's money. I don't want their money. They don't control me. I'm doing what's right for you. It's the establishment.
All right, I think two sound bites right there that really kind of sum up what we were just talking about in the previous segment. You got Sarah Palin talking about some conservatives not being conservative enough, and then Donald Trump hitting the establishment, talking about the hatred that they have for him in his campaign.
And to discuss this further, we want to welcome back to our roundtable former White House spokesperson for President George W. Bush, Pete Seat, and senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner, David Drucker. Thank you, gentlemen, for sticking around.
Sure.
All right, so we're talking about the Trump and Palin alliance. They were criticizing the GOP establishment, and also you hear Sarah Palin talking about how some conservatives are not conservative enough. The article in The Hill today, let's take a look at that. Quoting that article right here, Republican donors are quietly coming around to the idea that Donald Trump could be their party's nominee for president. But Pete, those are the same donors that Donald Trump was blasting in that soundbite we just heard there. If there's really this alliance, I don't think he's buying that.
Yeah, it's funny to hear him say that he's beholden to no one because he doesn't take campaign contributions, when the reality is the only person he's beholden to, I think, is himself and his own ego. So I laugh every time I hear it. But I think Palin and Trump are making the calculation that the base is far more important. They're using the well-worn analysis from 2012 that the base conservatives didn't come out to vote. There's questions about how accurate that is, but they believe it's all about getting the base there, and that the establishment, the so-called establishment, a term I'm not that fond of, but we'll just use it, that the establishment will fall in line for whomever the nominee is when that time comes. And they think that's what will happen. That's the way it's always been. And it's about securing that nomination. And the power brokers, the donors, the money folks will just fall in line and do what they have to do because they want to beat Hillary Clinton.
On the last round, we talked about the Cruz and Trump rivalry, and compared to Cruz, Trump seems to have more of that, sorry to use this term again, Pete, but the GOP establishment support. David, does this show the GOP is pulling away from more conservative candidates?
No, and I just reject the notion that the establishment's pulling for Trump and it's going to fall in line with Trump. I just can't repeat enough. If you talk to Republicans on Capitol Hill, you're going to hear more sympathy for Trump because they hate Cruz because of the way they feel he's treated them. But if you talk to the party at large, veteran operatives, donors, that includes both movement conservatives and operatives aligned with the establishment, they're going to look at this globally and say that if they are forced to choose, they'll go with Cruz because even if he's conservative by convenience or for his own ambition, they can depend on him to keep the Republican Party conservative. They worry that both Cruz and Trump are bad for the party in a general election and bad long term, but they'll stick with Cruz just because at least he's a Republican. And with Trump, you don't know what you get, and you don't know what the damages are going to be. And I think really that'll end up being the story, no matter what Cruz is telling you, because it's really a great storyline for him to have the establishment supposedly lining up with Trump, and no matter what Trump is telling you, because he wants you to believe that he's against the establishment.
I want to bring up another familiar face, Republican. Let's bring up retired Congressman Dr. Ron Paul. Let's take a look at something he had to say last night on the Malzberg Show. We want to get your reaction.
Realistically, is Trump going to be the nominee at this point?
Well, at this point, certainly is realistic.
Pete, I want to start with you. Does this go to show that Republicans are kind of accepting the idea of Trump as the nominee, especially since Ron's own son, Rand, is still on the ballot?
Yeah, that's got to be tough for Rand Paul to hear that.
I mean, ouch! Part of me was
Daddy issues.
Oh my gosh, I'm just thinking of my dad doing something like that and how that was
I think he
tough.
might have gotten a phone call after that. I'm not sure. We'll have to verify
I would
that.
hope so.
But go ahead, Pete.
No, I don't know. I mean, we can argue over whether Ron Paul is actually a Republican too, and if his analysis is that worthy. But people are slowly coming to grips that this could be a reality. There's still a lot of time. I keep telling myself that anything can happen. But I think if the votes were taken today, he would be the nominee of the party.
Well, very interesting to hear it said. David, just real quickly, we only have a few seconds left. Were you surprised at all?
No, I wasn't surprised because Ron Paul is usually off his rocker a little bit.
All right.
And I have a theory, too, about the whole
But
Bob
Paul
Dole
would-
thing. I think he just wants to burn the whole thing down over there in that little rivalry. He's throwing fuel on that fire. Meanwhile, John Kasich's laughing up there in New Hampshire, ready to make a comeback.
Conspiracy theorist over here.
I think maybe, perhaps.
Anyway, David, Pete, thank you so much for joining us. Pleasure to have you, gentlemen.
Anytime. Thank you.
Straight ahead, they can be the candidate's most effective tools. Former Congressman and Newsmax Prime host J.D. Hayworth joins us next to show some of the best presidential campaign ads of the season.